The coffee mug slipped from Bill Henderson's weathered hands, shattering against the cabin floor as thunderous pounding shook his front door at 3:17 a.m. Through the storm-lashed window, his flashlight beam revealed not a lost hiker, but a massive grizzly bear with two tiny cubs clinging desperately to her ice-covered fur. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory from their last bitter phone call 8 months ago. "Dad, you're losing your mind up there alone." Maybe she was right. The bear's dark eyes met his through the glass, not wild with hunger, but hollow, with the same desperate exhaustion he'd seen in his own mirror every morning since Martha died. She wasn't there to attack. She was there to beg. His arthritic fingers trembled on the door handle as his heart medication rattled in the empty prescription bottle on the counter. One decision would either save them all or get him killed. What kind of man opens his door to death itself? And what happens when death turns out to have a mother's heart? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Bill Henderson had taught 4th grade for 40 years, and in all that time, he'd never met a problem that couldn't be solved with patience, understanding, and a good cup of coffee. But standing in his doorway at 3 in the morning, staring down a 600-pound grizzly bear, he was beginning to think his teaching methods might need some adjustment. The storm had been building all evening, unusual for late March in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Golf ball-sized hail hammered the metal roof of his cabin like angry fists, while tornado sirens wailed in the distance. Bill had weathered plenty of storms in his 68 years, but nothing quite like this. The power had flickered out around midnight, leaving him with just the crackling fireplace and the battery-powered radio that kept cutting between static and emergency broadcasts. He'd been sitting in Martha's old rocking chair, the one she'd claimed during their 43 years of marriage, reading her final letter for the 1,000th time. The paper was wearing thin from his fingers, tracing the words, "Bill, honey, don't you dare spend the rest of your life talking to my picture. Find the family you're meant to have, even if it comes in ways you never expected." "Well, Martha," he thought grimly, "I don't think this is what you had in mind." The cabin had been their dream home, built board by board with his own hands back when his joints didn't creak like old floorboards, and his heart didn't require daily medication to keep beating. Nestled on 40 acres of dense woodland, it was the perfect place to raise a family. They'd planned on filling those empty bedrooms with grandchildren's laughter. Instead, Bill filled them with regret and unopened bills from the bank. His daughter Sarah lived 3 hours away in Atlanta with her husband and 5-year-old son, Bill's grandson, whom he'd met exactly twice. Their Christmas phone call had lasted exactly 7 minutes and ended with Sarah saying she was concerned about his mental state, and maybe it was time to consider other living arrangements. Translation: the nursing home brochures she'd been mailing him weren't subtle hints. The teaching pension barely covered the mortgage payments, and his heart medication cost more each month than he used to spend on groceries. The foreclosure notice was buried somewhere in the stack of mail he'd stopped opening weeks ago. What was the point? Martha was gone. Sarah wanted him warehoused with other forgotten old folks, and he was just marking time until his ticker finally gave out. But Martha's perfume still lingered in the bedroom closet. Her coffee mug, the one that read, "World's Best Teacher's Wife," still sat in the kitchen cabinet, washed and waiting. Every morning he set the table for 2 out of habit, then put away the extra plate with a hollow ache in his chest that no amount of medication could cure. Lord have mercy, he missed her voice. Especially now, when he needed her steady wisdom to tell him what any reasonable person should do when a desperate mother showed up at your door, even if she happened to weigh more than his pickup truck. The bear didn't charge when Bill opened the door. She didn't rear up on her hind legs or bare her teeth in the threatening display he'd seen in nature documentaries. Instead, she took one careful step forward and stopped, her massive head tilted slightly as if asking permission. The two cubs pressed against her flanks were so small they could have fit in Martha's old laundry basket, their fur matted with ice and their tiny bodies shaking uncontrollably. "Well, I'll be damned," Bill whispered, his breath visible in the frigid air. The mother bear's eyes, deep brown and surprisingly intelligent, met his gaze directly. There was no wildness in them, no predatory calculation, only exhaustion and something that looked remarkably like hope. Martha's voice echoed in his memory from 30 years ago when they'd found an injured raccoon family in their garage. "Sometimes, Bill, God sends help wearing fur instead of wings. The least we can do is not slam the door in his face." The wind howled through the trees, bending them nearly horizontal, and another crack of thunder made the cubs whimper. The smaller one, a female, Bill guessed, stumbled and nearly fell. Her mother immediately lowered her great head to nudge the cub upright, the gesture so tender and protective that it took Bill's breath away. "Come on, then," he heard himself saying, stepping back from the doorway. "Can't have you freezing to death on my front porch. Martha would never forgive me." The bear moved with surprising grace for such a massive creature, her claws clicking softly on the hardwood floor Bill had installed by hand 20 years ago. The cubs followed on unsteady legs, staying close to their mother's sides. Once inside, they huddled together near the stone fireplace, steam rising from their soaked fur as the warmth began to work its magic. Bill closed the door and turned the deadbolt, though he couldn't help wondering who exactly he was trying to keep out, or in. His heart was hammering against his ribs hard enough to rattle his dentures, and he fumbled for the pill bottle in his shirt pocket. 2 tiny white tablets dissolved under his tongue while he tried to process what he'd just done. "Okay, Bill," he muttered to himself. "You've officially lost your marbles. 68 years of sensible living, and you choose tonight to invite certain death in for coffee." But the cubs were so small, barely the size of cocker spaniel puppies. The female seemed particularly fragile, her breathing shallow and labored. Teaching had given Bill enough experience with sick children to recognize the symptoms of exhaustion and possible respiratory distress. Without thinking, he grabbed the old quilt Martha had stitched for their never-born grandchildren and gently spread it on the floor near the fire. The mother bear watched every movement with laser focus, but when Bill retreated to his chair and made no aggressive moves, she seemed to relax slightly. The cubs immediately gravitated toward the warmth of the quilt, curling up together like a pair of living teddy bears. "Lord have mercy," Bill breathed, settling into Martha's rocking chair with his rifle across his knees. "What am I supposed to do now?" The answer came with another violent gust of wind that rattled every window in the cabin. Through the chaos of the storm, he could hear the distant sound of trees crashing to the ground. Whatever had driven this bear family to his door, going back outside in this weather would be a death sentence for all of them. Bill had spent enough time in these mountains to know that grizzlies didn't typically come this far south, especially not with such young cubs. Something had gone terribly wrong with their natural habitat, probably the unprecedented flooding from the spring storms that had been hammering the region for weeks. The news had been full of reports about wildlife displacement, though he'd never imagined it would literally show up at his front door. The female cub whimpered softly, and her mother immediately responded with a low, rumbling sound that was almost musical. Bill had heard that sound before, years ago when he'd volunteered with the local wildlife rescue organization. It was the sound a mother bear made to comfort her young, a lullaby in Grizzly language. Martha had loved those volunteering days. She'd insisted that teaching children about respecting wildlife was just as important as teaching them arithmetic and reading. They'd spent countless weekends at the rescue center, helping rehabilitate injured animals before releasing them back to the wild. Some of Bill's happiest memories involved watching Martha bottle feed orphaned cubs or gently bandaging a hawk's broken wing. "You always said animals could sense good people," Bill whispered to the empty air, hoping Martha's spirit could somehow hear him. "I sure hope you're right, sweetheart, because I'm trusting that theory with my life right now." The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, an odd sense of peace began to settle over the room. The fire crackled steadily, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The cubs' breathing gradually became deeper and more regular as warmth seeped into their small bodies. Their mother remained alert but no longer tense, her massive form a protective barrier between her babies and any potential threat. Bill found himself studying her more closely. She was magnificent, even in her bedraggled state, easily 7 feet long and probably close to 400 pounds. Her fur was a rich brown with golden highlights that caught the firelight. There was a small scar above her left eye, barely visible through the thick fur, and something about her bearing suggested intelligence far beyond what most people attributed to wild animals. "You've been through hell, haven't you, girl?" he murmured softly. The bear's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and she turned her great head toward him. For a moment, their eyes met across the room, and Bill could have sworn he saw understanding flicker in those dark depths. The male cub, slightly larger and more adventurous than his sister, lifted his head and looked directly at Bill with curious black eyes. There was no fear in that gaze, only the natural inquisitiveness of youth. He reminded Bill painfully of his grandson Tommy, whom he'd seen only in photographs Sarah occasionally texted during her brief duty calls. "Well, you're certainly more polite house guest than some folks I could mention," Bill said with a weak smile. "At least you wiped your feet before coming in." The absurdity of his situation began to sink in. Here he was, having a conversation with a family of grizzly bears while a tornado warning howled outside his windows. If Sarah could see him now, she'd have him committed to the nearest psychiatric facility before breakfast. But for the first time in months, Bill didn't feel alone in the cabin that had become more tomb than home. The sound of steady breathing filled the silence that had been his only companion since Martha's funeral. Even if his new roommates happened to be apex predators, they were alive, and they needed him. That realization warmed something in his chest that had been frozen solid for far too long. Bill jerked awake in Martha's rocking chair as pale dawn light filtered through the storm-battered windows. His rifle had slipped from his lap during the night, and his neck felt like it had been twisted by a particularly vindictive chiropractor. For a moment he forgot about his unusual house guests and simply enjoyed the novelty of sleeping through the night without waking in a cold sweat from another nightmare about Martha's final days in the hospital. Then he saw them. The mother bear lay stretched across his living room floor like a massive, breathing rug, her cubs curled against her belly in perfect contentment. The smaller female was tucked under her mother's protective foreleg, breathing easily now that the warmth had worked its magic. The male cub had somehow migrated during the night and was now sleeping pressed against the hearthstones, his tiny form rising and falling in the steady rhythm of deep sleep. "Lord have mercy," Bill whispered, his voice hoarse from the dry mountain air. "It wasn't a dream after all." The mother bear's eyes opened at the sound of his voice, instantly alert, but showing no sign of alarm. She didn't move, just watched him with those unnervingly intelligent dark eyes as he slowly rose from the chair, his joints protesting every movement. At 68, sleeping in a rocking chair was about as comfortable as bedding down on a pile of railroad spikes. Bill padded carefully to the kitchen, acutely aware of every creaking floorboard beneath his feet. The power was still out, but his propane stove worked just fine, and soon the familiar ritual of making coffee helped steady his nerves. The normalcy of measuring grounds and filling the percolator felt like an anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted sideways. While the coffee percolated, he peered out the kitchen window at the storm's aftermath. 3 mature oaks had fallen across his driveway, their massive trunks creating an impenetrable barrier. Power lines hung in twisted tangles, and the road was littered with enough debris to make travel impossible for days. Even if he'd wanted to call someone about his situation, and he wasn't sure he did, the phone lines were down and his old flip phone showed no signal bars. "Well, that settles that," he muttered, pouring coffee into his favorite mug. "Looks like we're all stuck together for a while." He was adding his usual 3 spoonfuls of sugar when the female cub whimpered softly from the living room. The sound was followed immediately by her mother's low, comforting rumble. Bill froze, spoon halfway to his mouth, as childhood memories came flooding back. His grandmother had made that exact same sound when he'd had nightmares, a wordless, soothing hum that somehow made everything feel safer. Something wasn't right with the little female. Even from the kitchen, Bill could hear the slight wheeze in her breathing that hadn't been there the night before. He'd heard that sound often enough during his teaching years to recognize the early signs of respiratory distress. Children got sick quickly and dramatically, and apparently bear cubs did too. Setting down his coffee, Bill opened the cabinet where Martha had kept their first aid supplies. Most of the medications were expired, but he found a bottle of children's liquid acetaminophen that was still good. Martha had always insisted on keeping it stocked, even after they'd given up hope of grandchildren visiting. "Easy does it," he murmured to himself, approaching the bear family with slow, deliberate movements. The mother bear's head lifted as he drew near, but she didn't growl or show her teeth. Instead, she seemed to be watching his hands, assessing his intentions. Bill knelt on the quilt beside the cubs, his heart hammering against his ribs. This close, he could see that the female was indeed struggling. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and her tiny nose felt warm when he gently touched it with the back of his hand. A fever, just like he'd suspected. "Your baby's sick, Mama," he said softly to the mother bear, meeting her eyes directly. "I know you can't understand me, but I've helped a lot of little ones over the years. Will you let me try?" The bear studied his face for what felt like an eternity. Then, incredibly, she lowered her great head to rest on her paws, a gesture that Bill interpreted as consent, or at least resigned acceptance. Working with the same gentle patience he'd used on countless anxious children, Bill managed to get a small dose of medicine into the cub. She fussed and whimpered, but her mother remained calm, occasionally nuzzling her baby with obvious concern. The male cub woke during the process and watched with bright, curious eyes that reminded Bill painfully of Tommy's expression when he'd watched Bill fix a broken toy. "There we go, little sweetheart," Bill murmured, settling back on his heels. "That should help with the fever." The mother bear lifted her head and looked directly at him again. This time, Bill could have sworn he saw gratitude in those dark depths. She reached out with her massive paw, slowly, deliberately, and gently touched his hand. The gesture lasted only a second, but it sent shock waves through Bill's entire understanding of the world. "Well, I'll be damned," he breathed. "You do understand, don't you?" His moment of wonder was interrupted by the sound of his old rotary phone ringing from the kitchen counter. The mechanical bell cut through the morning quiet like a fire alarm, causing both cubs to startle awake. Bill's blood ran cold as he recognized the distinctive ring pattern, long distance. There was only one person who would be calling him at 7 in the morning after a major storm, and she lived 3 hours away in Atlanta. Sarah must have seen the weather reports and decided to check on her crazy old father living alone in the mountains. The phone rang again, and Bill realized he was facing a choice that would change everything. He could answer it and try to explain why he couldn't talk right now, a conversation that would inevitably lead to uncomfortable questions about his mental state. Or he could let it ring and deal with the consequences of Sarah thinking something terrible had happened to him. The mother bear watched him with those knowing eyes as the phone rang a third time, almost as if she understood that their precarious peace was about to be shattered by the outside world. Bill answered the phone on the fourth ring, his voice carefully modulated to sound normal despite the fact that his living room currently resembled a scene from National Geographic. "Henderson residence." "Dad, thank God you're okay." Sarah's voice crackled through the static-filled connection, tight with worry. "I've been watching the weather reports all night. They're saying it was the worst spring storm system to hit the region in 50 years. Are you hurt? Is the cabin damaged?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," Bill said, watching the mother bear's ears swivel toward the sound of his voice. The cubs were stirring on their makeshift bed, the female looking marginally better after her medicine. "Just some trees down in the driveway, nothing I can't handle." "Trees down? Dad, you shouldn't be out there alone trying to clear debris at your age." "What if you have another episode with your heart?" Bill's jaw tightened at the reference to his cardiac incident 6 months ago, a minor arrhythmia that Sarah had blown completely out of proportion. "It was barely a flutter, and Dr. Peterson said my EKGs have been normal ever since we adjusted my medication." "That's not the point, and you know it." Sarah's voice took on that familiar edge of frustrated concern that had become the hallmark of their conversations. "Dad, I've been thinking about our talk at Christmas. Maybe it's time we seriously discussed some alternatives to you living out there all alone." The mother bear lifted her massive head, those dark eyes fixed on Bill with an intensity that made him wonder if she could somehow sense the tension in his voice. The male cub had wandered over to Martha's old music box on the coffee table, sniffing at it with innocent curiosity. "Sarah, we've been over this. I'm not interested in your alternatives, and this really isn't a good time to—" "It's never a good time with you anymore, Dad. That's exactly the problem." Her voice softened slightly, taking on the patient tone she'd probably learned in whatever corporate sensitivity training her job required. "Look, I know this is hard. I know you miss Mom terribly, but isolating yourself up there isn't healthy. When's the last time you had a real conversation with another human being?" Bill glanced at the Bear family and fought back an inappropriate urge to laugh. "You might be surprised. This isn't a joke, Dad. I'm worried about you. We all are." "We?" There was a pause that stretched too long, and Bill felt his stomach drop. "Who's we, Sarah?" "I've been talking to Dr. Peterson about your depression, and I may have consulted with a few elder care specialists about options in the Atlanta area. There's a really nice assisted living community just 20 minutes from my house. They have activities, social interaction, medical care on site." "You did what?" Bill's voice rose sharply enough to make both cubs look up in alarm. The mother bear immediately shifted position, moving protectively closer to her babies. "You discussed my private medical information with strangers, without my consent? Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be. I'm trying to help you. After Mom died, you just disappeared. You stopped returning calls, stopped visiting, stopped living. When I drove up for Christmas, you looked like you hadn't been eating regularly in weeks." Bill closed his eyes, remembering that awkward visit. Sarah had bustled around the cabin like a concerned social worker, making lists of everything she thought needed attention. The expired food in the refrigerator, the pile of unopened mail, the layer of dust on Martha's piano. She'd meant well, but her efficiency had felt like an indictment of his entire existence. "I'm managing just fine on my own. Are you? Because the bank called me last week, Dad?" The words hit Bill like a physical blow. He sank into the kitchen chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 68 years. "They had no right to contact you. You listed me as your emergency contact on all your financial accounts, remember? When Mom was sick and you were trying to keep track of all the medical bills?" Sarah's voice gentled. "Dad, they're talking about foreclosure. How long have you been behind on the mortgage payments?" Bill stared at the stack of unopened mail on his counter, most of it bearing the ominous red lettering of overdue notices. It's temporary. The pension checks have been delayed because of some computer problems, but— Dad, stop. Please just stop. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. I know about the pension. I called them. There are no computer problems. You've been cashing the checks and spending the money on what? Because it's certainly not going toward the bills. The truth was too pathetic to admit. Most of Martha's life insurance money had gone to pay for her medical treatments that their insurance hadn't covered. The rest he'd been spending on things like fresh flowers for her grave every week, donations to the Cancer Research Foundation in her name, and the ridiculously expensive heart medications that kept him alive for reasons he couldn't quite remember anymore. I've been making some donations, charitable causes that Martha cared about. Dad, Sarah's voice was patient but firm, I'm driving up there today. We need to have a serious conversation about your future, and it needs to happen face to face. I should be there by 6 o'clock. Bill's heart rate spiked so violently he could feel it pounding in his temples. No, Sarah, that's not necessary. The roads are probably still blocked, and I've already arranged for a tow truck to clear your driveway if needed. Dad, I love you, but this isn't a request. I'm coming, and we're going to sort this out once and for all. The line went dead, leaving Bill staring at the phone in his hand while his world crumbled around him. 6 hours. Sarah would be here in 6 hours, expecting to find her depressed, slightly addled father living alone with his grief and his unpaid bills. Instead, she'd find him hosting a grizzly bear family in his living room like some deranged version of Goldilocks. Well, that's just perfect, he muttered, hanging up the phone. The mother bear was watching him intently, and he could have sworn those dark eyes held a question. My daughter's coming for a visit, and she's planning to drag me off to some old folks' home where I can play bingo and eat pureed vegetables until I die. The female cub whimpered softly, and Bill realized her fever was breaking. The medicine had worked, and her breathing sounded clearer. Under different circumstances, he would have felt proud of his makeshift veterinary skills. Right now, all he could think about was the impossibility of explaining this situation to Sarah. He spent the next hour trying to come up with a plan. Maybe he could somehow convince the bears to leave before Sarah arrived. He could pile food outside to lure them back into the woods, then clean up any evidence of their visit. The cubs were stronger now, and the weather had cleared enough that they might be able to survive a trek to better shelter. But every time he looked at the little female, still weak from her illness, he knew he couldn't force them back outside. And the mother bear seemed to have no intention of leaving voluntarily. She'd found warmth, safety, and medical care for her sick baby. From her perspective, this arrangement was working perfectly. Bill was attempting to calculate how long it might take to clear the cub's fur out of the furniture when he heard the sound of a truck engine grinding up his mountain road. His blood froze. Sarah had said 6 o'clock, but it was barely noon. Maybe the tow truck driver had made better time than expected, or maybe the engine sound was wrong, too rough, too loud. Sarah drove a sensible Honda sedan, not whatever diesel monster was currently navigating his damaged driveway. Bill peered through the kitchen window and felt his stomach drop as he spotted an unfamiliar pickup truck bouncing through the debris field that had been his front yard. The truck stopped near his porch, and a man climbed out. Middle-aged, dressed in camouflage, carrying what looked like a high-powered rifle with a scope. Bill's mind raced through possibilities. Lost hunter, neighbor checking on storm damage, or something worse. The man approached the cabin with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He knocked on the front door with sharp, authoritative raps that made the cubs scramble to their feet in alarm. The mother bear immediately moved into a protective stance, her massive body positioned between her babies and the door. Sir, I know you're in there. I saw the smoke from your chimney." The man's voice carried the flat accent of someone who'd grown up in these mountains. "I'm tracking a dangerous grizzly in this area. Large female with cubs. My name's Marcus Stone, and I need to ask you a few questions." Bill's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized the full horror of his situation. A bear hunter. Someone who made his living killing exactly the creatures currently camped out in his living room. The mother bear seemed to sense the threat as well. Her ears were pinned back, and a low growl rumbled from deep in her chest. "Just a minute," Bill called out, his mind racing. He could claim he hadn't seen any bears, but the man sounded like he knew what he was doing. Professional trackers could read signs that ordinary people would miss. Paw prints in the mud, claw marks on trees, scattered fur caught on branches. "Sir, I don't mean to alarm you, but this animal is extremely dangerous. She's been raiding campsites and threatening hikers for the past week. I've got authorization from the State Wildlife Department to eliminate the threat." Bill felt something break open in his chest, a fierce protectiveness he hadn't experienced since Sarah was small and being bullied at school. The Bear family had trusted him with their lives, had shown him more genuine affection and gratitude in 12 hours than he'd received from any human in months. He wasn't about to betray that trust to some trigger-happy hunter who saw dollar signs where Bill saw a desperate mother trying to save her children. "I haven't seen any bears," he called through the door, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. "Storm kept me inside all night." "That's interesting, sir, because I can see tracks leading right up to your front porch. Large ones. And the trail stops here." The mother bear was looking directly at Bill now, those intelligent eyes seeming to understand that their sanctuary had just become a trap. The cubs pressed closer to their mother, sensing her tension. The little female was still weak from her illness, hardly in any condition for a desperate flight through the wilderness. Bill looked at Martha's photograph on the mantel, remembering her voice from all those years ago. "Sometimes, Bill, you have to choose between what's easy and what's right. The easy choice is usually the one you'll regret forever." Taking a deep breath, Bill opened the door just wide enough to step outside, pulling it firmly shut behind him. Marcus Stone was younger than his voice had suggested, maybe mid-40s, with the lean build and weathered face of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His rifle was expensive-looking, with a scope that probably cost more than Bill's monthly pension check. "Like I said, I haven't seen any bears." Bill folded his arms across his chest, trying to project a confidence he definitely didn't feel. "You're welcome to look around the property if you want, but I'd appreciate it if you didn't disturb anything unnecessarily. I'm an old man, living alone, and I don't need any trouble." Marcus studied Bill's face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading lies. His eyes were hard, calculating, but there was something else there too. Something that looked almost like desperation. "Sir, with all due respect, I've been tracking this bear for 3 days. Her trail leads directly to your door and then just stops. Now, either she sprouted wings and flew away, or she found somewhere to hole up until the storm passed." Marcus gestured toward the cabin with the barrel of his rifle. "I'm going to need to take a look inside." Bill felt the world tilt sideways as he realized he was about to face the most important choice of his life. Behind that door were 3 lives depending on his protection. In 6 hours his daughter would arrive, expecting to find her father safely tucked away from all dangerous decisions. And standing in front of him was a man with a gun who represented everything Bill had come to despise about a world that valued profit over compassion. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that," Bill said quietly. "This is private property, and I don't recall inviting you inside." Marcus's expression hardened. "Sir, I don't think you understand the situation here. That bear has killed livestock, destroyed property, and terrorized innocent people." She's a menace, and every hour she stays alive puts more lives at risk." "What lives?" Bill found himself asking. "Whose lives are actually at risk from a mother bear trying to protect her cubs?" Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or recognition that he was dealing with someone who wouldn't be easily intimidated. "That's not the point. The point is that I have a job to do, and I'm going to do it whether you cooperate or not." Bill looked at this stranger who spoke so casually about killing, thought about Sarah's phone call and her plans to warehouse him somewhere safe and sterile, and felt something harden in his chest that had been soft for far too long. Maybe it was time for one old schoolteacher to finally take a stand for something that mattered. "Then I guess we have a problem," Bill said, stepping back toward his front door. "Because you're not getting inside my house without a warrant, and something tells me the local sheriff might have a few questions about someone wandering around with high-powered weapons during a state of emergency." Marcus's face flushed red with anger, and for a moment Bill thought the man might actually point that rifle at him. Instead, he took a step back and forced what was probably meant to be a conciliatory smile. "Look, old-timer, I don't want any trouble with you, but that bear needs to be eliminated, and it's going to happen one way or another. You can make this easy, or you can make it hard, but it's going to happen." Bill thought about Martha, about the bears sleeping trustfully in his living room, about Sarah's imminent arrival and all the impossible explanations he'd have to give. Then he thought about the promise he'd made at Martha's funeral to start living a life she could be proud of. "Well then," he said, his hand on the door handle, "I guess it's going to be hard." Marcus Stone circled Bill's cabin like a predator testing the boundaries of its territory, his rifle held with the casual confidence of someone who'd never questioned his right to kill. Through the kitchen window, Bill watched the hunter examine every inch of the porch, kneeling to study paw prints that were probably clear as highway signs to someone with his training. "I know you're lying to me, old man," Marcus called out, his voice carrying easily through the thin mountain air. "These tracks are fresh, less than 12 hours old. That bear and her cubs are somewhere close, and I'm betting they're a lot closer than you want to admit." Inside the cabin, the mother bear had positioned herself directly in front of the door, her massive form creating an impenetrable barrier between her cubs and whatever threat lurked outside. The little female was pressed against her mother's side, still weak from her illness, but alert enough to sense the danger. Her brother had retreated to the furthest corner of the living room, his dark eyes wide with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Bill's hand shook as he double-checked the locks on his doors and windows, knowing full well that no amount of hardware could stop a determined man with a high-powered rifle. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent the past year believing he had nothing left to live for, and now he was facing the prospect of dying to protect 3 creatures that most people would consider nothing more than dangerous animals. But they weren't just animals to him anymore. The mother bear had trusted him with her children's lives, had shown him a grace and dignity that put most humans to shame. The way she'd gently touched his hand after he'd given medicine to her sick cub had been more meaningful than any expression of gratitude he'd received in months. "Mr. Henderson, that is your name, isn't it?" "I did some checking." Marcus had moved closer to the front door, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more threatening than his earlier anger. "You used to teach at the elementary school down in Asheville, retired about 8 years ago after your wife got sick. I heard you two used to volunteer with some kind of animal rescue operation." Bill's blood ran cold. This wasn't some random encounter with a lost hunter. Marcus had done his homework, which meant he'd been planning this confrontation for longer than Bill had initially realized. "Funny thing about animal rescue volunteers," Marcus continued, his boots heavy on the wooden porch. "They tend to get real attached to the creatures they help. Sometimes they get so attached that they make poor decisions, dangerous decisions. The mother bear's ears were pinned flat against her massive skull, and a low growl rumbled from deep in her chest. She could sense the menace in Marcus's voice, even if she couldn't understand the words. Bill found himself moving closer to her, drawn by an instinct he didn't fully understand. "You know what I think happened here, Mr. Henderson? I think that bear showed up at your door last night during the storm, probably with those cubs half dead from exposure, and I think your bleeding heart got the better of your common sense. Am I warm?" Bill pressed his back against the living room wall, his heart medication doing little to calm the arrhythmia that was making his chest feel like a trapped bird. Through the window, he could see Marcus examining the exterior walls, looking for any sign of the bear's presence. "The thing is," Marcus called out, "I'm not just some weekend warrior with more money than sense. This is my livelihood we're talking about. That bear's pelt is worth $50,000 to the right buyer, and those cubs, well, let's just say there are collectors who pay premium prices for exotic pets." The casual way Marcus discussed selling bear cubs as exotic pets made Bill's stomach turn. These weren't commodities to be harvested and sold. They were a family, with bonds and feelings and the same desperate love for their children that any parent would recognize. The male cub had crept closer to Bill, apparently seeking comfort from the only human he'd learned to trust. Without thinking, Bill reached down to gently stroke the soft fur behind the cub's ears. The little creature leaned into his touch with a contentment that was both heartbreaking and heartwarming. "Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Henderson," Marcus continued, his voice growing harder. "I'm going to give you exactly 10 minutes to think this through. 10 minutes to decide whether you want to be remembered as a helpful neighbor who did his civic duty, or as an obstinate old fool who interfered with legal wildlife management." Legal wildlife management. The euphemism made Bill want to spit. There was nothing legal about what Marcus was planning. No licensed hunter would be operating alone during a state of emergency, and no legitimate wildlife official would be talking about selling cubs to private collectors. Bill thought about the phone call he'd ignored earlier that morning, the one that had come in while he'd been dealing with the female cub's fever. The caller ID had shown a number he didn't recognize, but now he wondered if it might have been someone trying to warn him about Marcus. Park rangers, maybe, or other wildlife officials who'd gotten wind of an illegal operation. "You still in there, old man?" Clock's ticking. The mother bear lifted her massive head and looked directly at Bill with those impossibly intelligent eyes. In their dark depths, he saw something that took his breath away. Not fear, but fierce determination. She was ready to fight for her children, even against impossible odds, even if it meant sacrificing herself in the process. That look reminded Bill of Martha during her final weeks in the hospital, when the doctors had stopped offering hope and started talking about comfort care. She'd faced her own mortality with the same unflinching courage, more concerned about Bill's future loneliness than her own approaching death. "Promise me something," she'd whispered during one of their last coherent conversations. "Promise me you won't just give up when I'm gone. Promise me you'll find something worth fighting for." Bill had made that promise through his tears, never imagining that something worth fighting for would turn out to be a family of bears who'd sought shelter from a storm. But as he looked at the cubs huddled against their mother's protective bulk, he realized that Martha would have understood completely. She'd always believed that love came in unexpected forms, and that the measure of a person's character was revealed in how they treated the most vulnerable creatures around them. The sound of splintering wood from the back of the cabin made Bill's heart leap into his throat. Marcus wasn't content to wait out his 10-minute deadline. He was testing other entry points, looking for the path of least resistance. The mother bear's head swiveled toward the sound, her body tensing for action. "Easy, Mama," Bill whispered, moving closer to the bear family. "We're going to get through this. All of us." But even as he spoke the words, Bill knew they were probably lies. Marcus had the advantage of superior firepower, and he clearly wasn't the type to be deterred by legal or moral considerations. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to open the door and let nature take its course. Sarah wouldn't have to worry about her father making any more poor decisions, and the bears, well, the bears would meet whatever fate awaited them in a world that increasingly had no room for wild creatures. The splintering sound came again, closer this time. Marcus had found the storm-damaged section of the back porch where several boards had been loosened by falling debris. Bill had been meaning to repair it for weeks, but depression and procrastination had conspired to leave his home's defenses compromised at exactly the wrong moment. "Last chance, Mr. Henderson." Marcus's voice carried a note of excitement now, the thrill of a predator who'd cornered his prey. "You can either walk away from this with a clear conscience and a healthy bank account. I'm prepared to offer you $10,000 for your cooperation, or you can face the consequences of harboring dangerous wildlife." $10,000. It was more money than Bill had seen at one time since Martha's life insurance payout, enough to catch up on his mortgage payments and maybe even afford the expensive heart medications his doctor kept prescribing. For a moment the temptation was almost overwhelming. But then the female cub whimpered softly, and Bill remembered the trust in her mother's eyes when she'd allowed him to administer medicine to her sick baby. Some things couldn't be bought or sold, and integrity was at the top of that list. The back door rattled in its frame as Marcus tested its strength. Bill realized he had perhaps 30 seconds before the confrontation moved inside his home, where 3 innocent lives hung in the balance. The cubs were too young to run, the mother bear too devoted to abandon them, and Bill himself too old and too stubborn to back down from what felt like the most important fight of his life. "Martha," he whispered to the empty air, hoping his wife's spirit could somehow hear him across whatever divide separated the living from the dead. "I sure could use some of that famous guidance of yours right about now." The answer came not in words, but in memory. Martha's voice from 40 years ago, when they'd been young teachers faced with a classroom full of troubled children that everyone else had written off as lost causes. "Bill, honey, sometimes the most important battles are the ones nobody expects you to win, but that doesn't mean they're not worth fighting." The back door gave way with a crash that seemed to shake the entire cabin. Marcus's heavy boots echoed through the kitchen as he made his way toward the living room where Bill waited with his unlikely family. The mother bear rose to her full height, nearly 7 feet of muscle and protective fury, while her cubs pressed against her legs in terror. Bill stepped forward, placing himself between the bears and the doorway where Marcus would soon appear. His arthritic hands found Martha's old walking stick, a sturdy piece of carved oak that she'd used during her final months. It wasn't much of a weapon against a high-powered rifle, but it was something to hold on to as he faced whatever came next. "This is your last warning, Mr. Henderson," Marcus called from the kitchen, his voice thick with adrenaline and barely controlled violence. "Step aside and let me do my job, or I'll go through you to get to them." Bill gripped the walking stick tighter and thought about all the lessons he'd taught over 4 decades in the classroom. Lessons about courage and kindness, about standing up to bullies and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. He'd preached those values to thousands of children, but he'd never been tested on them under circumstances this extreme. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room. Bill could hear Marcus breathing heavily, probably surveying the scene and calculating his next move. The mother bear's growl deepened to a rumble that Bill could feel in his bones, while the cubs whimpered in perfect counterpoint to their mother's rage. "Well, I'll be damned," Marcus said softly, his voice filled with something that might have been admiration or contempt. "You actually did it. You actually let wild animals into your home. Bill turned to face the doorway where Marcus stood silhouetted against the kitchen light, rifle raised and ready. But something in the hunter's expression had changed. The predatory confidence had been replaced by something more complex, more human. "You know," Marcus continued, his weapon still trained on the Bear family, "I had a teacher once who would have done something exactly this stupid. Mr. Henderson, actually. Funny coincidence, don't you think?" Bill's world tilted sideways as recognition dawned. The eyes were older now, harder, marked by disappointments and compromises that the eager 10-year-old boy had never imagined. But underneath the weathered features and the hunter's cold demeanor, Bill could still see traces of the child who'd sat in the front row of his fourth-grade classroom 25 years ago. "Marcus Stone," he whispered, the walking stick slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers. "Little Marcus, who used to bring injured birds to class." The rifle trembled in Marcus Stone's hands as 25 years of buried memories came flooding back. Bill watched his former student's face cycle through emotions: surprise, recognition, pain, and something that looked dangerously like shame. The eager 10-year-old boy who used to stay after school to help feed the classroom hamsters was still there, trapped inside a man who killed animals for money. "You remember," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. The weapon was still pointed at the Bear family, but his grip had loosened and Bill could see doubt creeping into his weathered features. "Of course I remember. You were the kid who cried when we had to put down the robin with the broken wing. You made me promise we'd have a proper funeral for it." Bill took a careful step forward, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "What happened to you, son?" The mother bear sensed the shift in dynamics and lowered herself slightly, though she remained coiled and ready to strike if needed. The cubs pressed closer to her massive flanks, their dark eyes darting between the two humans whose conversation seemed to have paused their death sentence. "Life happened, Mr. Henderson. Life happened, and all those pretty lessons you taught us about kindness and protecting innocent creatures. Well, they don't put food on the table or pay medical bills." Marcus's laugh was bitter, hollow. "My daughter Jenny is 8 years old. Same age I was when you taught me that every living thing deserves compassion. You want to know what she's doing right now? She's lying in a hospital bed in Charlotte, pumped full of chemicals that are supposed to kill the cancer eating her alive." Bill's heart clenched as the pieces of Marcus's story began to fall into place. The desperation in his former student's eyes wasn't just greed, it was the wild panic of a parent watching his child die. "The treatments aren't covered by insurance. Experimental, they call them, which is just a fancy way of saying we're on our own. $500,000, Mr. Henderson, that's what it costs to maybe save my little girl's life." Marcus's voice broke slightly. "So yes, I hunt bears now. And yes, I sell their parts to rich collectors who think owning exotic animals makes them special. Because my daughter's life is worth more than any animal's, no matter what you taught me in 4th grade." The female cub chose that moment to whimper softly, still weak from her recent illness. The sound seemed to cut through Marcus like a blade, and Bill watched him flinch as if he'd been physically struck. Whatever walls the man had built around his conscience, they weren't completely impenetrable. "She looks sick," Marcus observed, his professional eye assessing the smaller cub. "Respiratory infection, probably. Cubs that age don't usually survive it in the wild." "She's getting better. I gave her some medicine." Bill's voice was steady, matter of fact. "Same kind Martha and I used to give you when you'd catch whatever bug was going around the classroom." The mention of Martha's name hit Marcus like another physical blow. Bill remembered now how his former student had adored Martha, how he'd often stayed after school just to help her organize supplies or clean the blackboard. Marcus had been one of those kids who craved adult attention and approval, probably because he wasn't getting enough of it at home. Mrs. Henderson always smelled like lavender, Marcus said suddenly, his rifle lowering slightly. She used to let me help her water the plants in the classroom. Said I had a natural gift with living things. She was right. You did. Bill took another small step forward. That gift doesn't just disappear, Marcus. It's still there, buried under all the pain and desperation. But it's still there. Is it? Marcus's voice was raw with self-loathing. Because I've killed 17 bears in the past 2 years, Mr. Henderson. Mothers, fathers, cubs who were barely old enough to be away from their mothers. I've become everything you taught me to despise, and I've done it all for money. The mother bear had been listening to this exchange with remarkable patience, her intelligent eyes tracking the emotions playing across both men's faces. Now, she did something that made Bill's breath catch in his throat. She took a single, deliberate step toward Marcus, not in attack, but in what looked almost like approach. Don't, Marcus warned, raising his rifle again. Don't make me do this. But the bear didn't stop. She moved with slow, careful dignity, her massive form radiating something that Bill could only describe as compassion. When she was close enough to touch the barrel of Marcus's rifle, she stopped and looked directly into his eyes. For a long moment, man and bear regarded each other in perfect silence. Bill watched, hardly daring to breathe, as something passed between them, some communication that transcended species barriers and spoke directly to whatever remained of Marcus's humanity. "She knows," Marcus whispered, his voice filled with wonder and horror. "She knows what I am, what I've done, and she's not afraid of me. Why isn't she afraid?" "Because she recognizes something in you that you've forgotten about yourself," Bill said softly. "She sees the same thing Martha and I saw in that 10-year-old boy who used to rescue earthworms from the playground after it rained." Marcus's facade finally cracked, and tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. The rifle slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor as he sank to his knees in front of the massive bear. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, the words torn from the deepest part of his soul. "God help me, I'm so sorry for what I've become." The mother bear did something then that defied every law of nature Bill thought he understood. She reached out with one massive paw and gently touched Marcus's shoulder, the same gesture of comfort she'd used with her cubs when they were frightened or hurt. "Jenny's going to die," Marcus whispered, his voice muffled by his hands. "My baby girl is going to die, and I've destroyed my soul trying to save her, and it still won't be enough." Bill knelt beside his former student, his arthritic joints protesting, but his heart overriding the physical discomfort. "Tell me about her. Tell me about Jenny." Through his tears, Marcus began to speak. He told Bill about a little girl who loved butterflies and painted pictures of animals she'd never seen. A child who still believed in magic and fairy tales despite the harsh reality of cancer treatments and endless hospital visits. A daughter who asked her father why he was sad all the time, who worried that somehow her illness was her fault. "She draws pictures of bears," Marcus said, his voice hollow with irony. "Happy bear families living in the forest. She has no idea that her daddy kills the very creatures she dreams about." The female cub had somehow made her way over to where Marcus knelt, and now she was sniffing cautiously at his camouflage jacket. Despite her recent illness, she seemed drawn to this broken man who'd threatened her family only moments before. "What's her name?" the cub seemed to be asking in her own wordless way, and Marcus found himself reaching out to gently stroke her soft fur. "Hope," Bill said suddenly, the name coming to him with startling clarity. "Her name should be Hope." "Because that's what she represents, the possibility that even in our darkest moments, life can surprise us with second chances." Marcus looked up through his tears, confusion mixing with the grief in his eyes. "Whose name?" the cub's name. Every creature deserves a name, deserves to be seen as an individual rather than just another commodity. Bill's voice gained strength as he spoke. And this little one's name is Hope, because she's the bridge between what you've become and what you could still choose to be. The sound of a car engine grinding up the mountain road cut through the emotional intensity of the moment like a chainsaw through silk. Bill's heart sank as he recognized the distinctive purr of Sarah's Honda sedan navigating the debris-strewn driveway. His daughter had arrived early, probably worried about the storm damage and determined to stage her intervention while Bill was still emotionally vulnerable. "That'll be my daughter," Bill said wearily. "She's come to take me away to some assisted living facility where I'll be safe from making any more questionable decisions." Marcus wiped his eyes and looked toward the front of the cabin, where Sarah's car door was already slamming shut. "What are you going to tell her?" Bill looked at the Bear family that had transformed his understanding of love and loyalty, then at his former student who'd lost his way in the darkness of desperation, and finally at the front door where his estranged daughter was about to discover that her father's mental state was far more complicated than she'd imagined. "The truth," he said simply. "I'm going to tell her the truth, and hope she loves me enough to understand." Sarah's key turned in the front lock just as Marcus was reaching for his rifle, and Bill realized that the next 60 seconds would determine whether this impossible situation ended in reconciliation or complete catastrophe. The mother bear immediately tensed, positioning herself protectively in front of her cubs, while Marcus looked like a man caught between salvation and damnation. "Dad, the back door's been damaged. What happened here?" Sarah's voice carried from the entryway, along with the sound of her setting down what was probably an overnight bag and a stack of manila folders that Bill suspected contained brochures for various elder care facilities. "Stay in the kitchen for a minute, sweetheart," Bill called out, his voice remarkably steady given that his living room currently resembled a wildlife documentary gone horribly wrong. "I need to explain something important before you come in here." "Explain what?" "Dad, you're scaring me." "And why does it smell like—" Sarah's footsteps stopped abruptly, and Bill could practically hear her brain processing the unmistakable musk of wild animals. "Oh my God, Dad, do you have a dog? Did you get a pet without telling me?" Marcus had gone completely still, his eyes darting between the rifle on the floor and the doorway where Sarah's voice originated. The man was clearly calculating whether he could grab his weapon and eliminate the witnesses before anyone could stop him. Bill recognized that look. It was the same desperate calculation he'd seen in cornered animals, the moment when flight was no longer possible and fight became the only option. But Hope, the female cub, chose that moment to toddle over to Marcus and gently bump her tiny head against his knee. The simple gesture of trust from the creature he'd been planning to kill seemed to drain all the violence out of the man, leaving him hollow-eyed and trembling. "Dad?" Sarah's voice was closer now, just outside the living room. "I'm coming in, and you better have a really good explanation for whatever—" She appeared in the doorway and stopped mid-sentence, her mouth falling open as she took in the scene before her. Her father kneeling beside a camouflage-clad stranger. A massive grizzly bear standing protectively over two cubs who were playing with Martha's old quilts. The rifle on the floor, the overturned furniture, the impossible reality of wild animals living peacefully in the home where she'd grown up. "Dad," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please tell me I'm having some kind of stress-induced hallucination." "I wish I could, sweetheart. But this is real." Bill rose slowly to his feet, his joints protesting after kneeling on the hardwood floor. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Bella and her cubs, Hope and Joy. They've been staying with me since the storm hit." Sarah's practical mind immediately began cataloging the dangers. "Dad, that's a grizzly bear in your living room with cubs. Do you have any idea how dangerous this situation is? Mother bears are incredibly protective of their young, and if she perceives any threat, she's not going to hurt anyone. Bill interrupted gently. We have an understanding. An understanding? With a wild animal? Sarah's voice rose to near hysteria. Dad, this is exactly what I was talking about. You're not thinking clearly. You're making dangerous decisions that could get you killed. Marcus had remained silent during this exchange, but now he spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. Your father saved their lives. The cubs would have died in that storm if he hadn't taken them in. Sarah turned her attention to the stranger for the first time, really looking at him. The rifle on the floor, the camouflage clothing, the tear-stained cheeks. And you are? Someone who was about to make the worst mistake of his life until your father reminded me who I used to be. Marcus met her gaze directly. My name is Marcus Stone. I was your father's student 25 years ago, and I came here today to kill this Bear family for money. The blunt honesty of the statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her hand reaching for the doorframe to steady herself. You came here to kill them? In my father's home? $50,000 for the mother's pelt, another $20,000 for the cubs to be sold as exotic pets. Marcus's voice was flat, clinical, as if he was reading from a medical report. My daughter has leukemia. The experimental treatments aren't covered by insurance. I've become the kind of person who justifies murder with medical bills. Sarah's training as a pharmaceutical researcher kicked in, even as her personal world tilted sideways. What kind of leukemia? What treatments? Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. She's 8 years old. The doctors want to try CAR T-cell therapy, but it's not approved for pediatric patients except through clinical trials that have waiting lists longer than... Marcus's voice broke again. Longer than she probably has. Sarah's expression shifted from fear and confusion to something more complex. Professional interest warred with maternal instinct. She had a 5-year-old son of her own, and the thought of watching him battle cancer was every parent's worst nightmare. There are other options, she said carefully. Patient advocacy groups, pharmaceutical company compassionate use programs, research institutions that... Do you think I haven't tried everything? Marcus's laugh was bitter. I've called every number, filled out every form, begged every doctor and administrator who would listen. The system doesn't care about one little girl from rural North Carolina. She's just another statistic, another acceptable loss in the war against cancer. Hope had wandered away from Marcus and was now investigating Sarah's purse, which she'd dropped when the shock of seeing the bears hit her. The little cub's curiosity about the mundane human objects, lipstick, car keys, smartphone, was so innocently charming that Sarah found herself smiling despite the surreal circumstances. She likes you, Bill observed. Animals are good judges of character. Dad, this is insane. You can't just keep wild animals as pets. Even if they're friendly now, they're going to grow bigger and stronger, and their instincts will eventually override any temporary domestication. Sarah's voice carried the patient tone of someone trying to reason with a confused elderly relative. And what happens when animal control finds out? Or when someone gets hurt? The mother bear, Bella, Bill had called her, chose that moment to approach Sarah with the same deliberate dignity she'd shown Marcus. Sarah froze, every instinct screaming at her to run, but something in the bear's dark eyes held her in place. Easy, sweetheart, Bill murmured, though it wasn't clear whether he was talking to his daughter or the bear. She's just saying hello. Bella stopped just close enough to touch, her massive head tilted slightly as she studied Sarah's face. There was intelligence in those dark eyes, a depth of understanding that seemed to see past Sarah's professional competence to the frightened daughter underneath. She's beautiful, Sarah whispered, the words surprising even herself. I never realized how expressive their faces are. Your father taught me that every living thing deserves respect and protection, Marcus said quietly. I'd forgotten that lesson until today, until I saw him risk his life to defend creatures that couldn't defend themselves. Sarah looked around the room, at her father standing protectively near the bear family, at the man who'd abandoned his hunting mission to kneel crying on the floor, at the cubs who'd somehow transformed her childhood home into something magical and impossible. This is why you didn't want me to visit, isn't it? She said to Bill. You knew I'd try to talk you out of helping them. I knew you'd worry. You've been worrying about me ever since your mother died, trying to wrap me in cotton wool and keep me safe from making any mistakes. Bill's voice was gentle but firm. But Sarah, honey, sometimes the biggest mistake is playing it too safe. Sometimes you have to risk everything for something that matters. And this matters? Risking your life for wild animals? These aren't just wild animals. They're a family. They love their children the same way we love ours. They mourn their losses the same way we do. They hope for better futures the same way we hope. Bill gestured to where hope was now curled up against joy, the two cubs finding comfort in each other's presence. How is their love any less valuable than ours? Sarah felt tears prickling her eyes as she watched the cubs together. The sight reminded her of Tommy, her 5-year-old son, and how he clung to his stuffed animals when he was frightened or sad. The parallels between human and animal families were impossible to ignore. The foreclosure notice, she said suddenly, the pieces clicking into place. You've been spending your pension money on them, haven't you? Food, medical supplies, whatever they needed. Some of it, Bill admitted, but most of the money problem started long before they arrived. I've been making donations to cancer research in your mother's name, keeping up her gravesite, buying medications I probably don't need. I guess I've been spending money on anything that made me feel like I was still connected to life instead of just waiting to die. Marcus looked up sharply at the mention of cancer research. You've been donating to cancer research while I've been killing animals to pay for cancer treatment. The irony is almost poetic. Maybe it's not irony, Sarah said slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. Maybe it's opportunity. Both men looked at her with curiosity, and even Bella seemed to sense that something important was happening. The mother bear settled onto her haunches, her cubs automatically arranging themselves beside her, as if she understood that the humans needed to talk about something that would affect all their futures. I work for Meridian Pharmaceutical, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as the plan took shape. We're one of the companies developing CAR T-cell therapies for pediatric cancers. I know the researchers, I know the protocols, and I know how to navigate the compassionate use application process. Marcus stared at her as if she'd just announced she could walk on water. You could help Jenny? I can't make any promises, but I can make sure her case gets reviewed by the right people. I can cut through the bureaucratic red tape that's been keeping her off the waiting lists. Sarah looked at her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. In exchange for my help with your daughter's treatment, you walk away from this hunting business forever. You'd do that? For a stranger? For someone who came here to kill animals you care about? Sarah thought about her father's lesson in compassion, about the bear family that had somehow taught an old man to hope again, about the interconnected nature of all the choices that had brought them to this moment. I'd do it because it's the right thing to do, and because my father spent his whole life teaching people like you that redemption is always possible, even when we think we've gone too far to turn back. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sounds of the cubs playing with each other, their innocence a stark contrast to the complex moral negotiations happening around them. Bill felt Martha's presence in the room as surely as if she'd been sitting in her old rocking chair, nodding approval at the unlikely family reunion unfolding in their living room. "What about the bears?" Marcus asked finally. "They can't stay here indefinitely. Eventually, someone's going to report them, or they're going to outgrow this arrangement." Sarah looked at the bear family, then at her father, then at the man who'd been transformed from hunter to protector in the space of a single conversation. "I think," she said carefully, "that we're going to need a much more complicated plan than any of us originally imagined." 6 months later, Bill Henderson stood at his kitchen window, watching Hope and Joy wrestle playfully in the meadow behind his cabin, their mother Bella supervising from the shade of an old oak tree. The bears had grown considerably. Hope was now the size of a medium dog, while Joy had the stocky build that promised he'd be as massive as his mother someday. But their personalities remained unchanged. Hope was still the gentle, thoughtful one, while Joy approached life with boundless curiosity and mischief. The foreclosure notice was gone, replaced by a mortgage payment book that Sarah had helped him reorganize. His heart medication was current, his bills were paid, and for the first time in years, Bill woke up each morning with something to look forward to. The bears had become part of his daily routine. Breakfast together by the fireplace, afternoon walks through the forest, quiet evenings where he'd read aloud from old children's books while the cubs listened with surprising attention. "Grandpa Bill! Grandpa Bill!" Tommy's voice carried across the meadow as Sarah's 5-year-old son came racing around the corner of the cabin, his face bright with excitement. Joy knocked over the water bucket again, and Hope is trying to help him clean up. Bill smiled as he watched his grandson, how easily that word came now, approach the bear cubs with the fearlessness that only children possessed. Tommy had been visiting every weekend since the spring, and his presence had completed the transformation of Bill's lonely refuge into something that felt genuinely like home. Sarah emerged from her car, dressed in the business casual attire that had become her uniform since taking the new position with the North Carolina Wildlife Research Foundation. The job paid less than her pharmaceutical work, but it allowed her to split time between research and spending weekends in the mountains with her father and son. "Any word from Marcus?" Bill asked as Sarah joined him on the porch, both of them watching Tommy attempt to teach the cubs how to play fetch with a tennis ball. "Jenny's latest blood work came back clean, complete remission for the 3rd month in a row." Sarah's smile was radiant. "The CAR-T therapy worked better than anyone dared hope. Marcus wanted me to tell you that he'll be by later this week with some photographs she drew. Apparently, they're all pictures of bear families living happily in the forest." Bill felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition and everything to do with the overwhelming gratitude that sometimes struck him without warning. Marcus had kept his end of their bargain, abandoning his hunting operation to become a wildlife photographer and conservation advocate. His work documenting bear behavior had already contributed to 3 research papers and a National Geographic article that had brought positive attention to wildlife protection efforts in North Carolina. "There's something else," Sarah continued, settling into Martha's old rocking chair with the ease of someone who belonged there. "The Wildlife Foundation wants to expand the bear rehabilitation program. They're looking for a permanent facility where orphaned cubs can be raised and eventually released back into the wild." Bill raised an eyebrow. "And?" "They want to base the program here. Your land, your cabin as the headquarters, you as the primary caretaker. It would mean a salary, full medical benefits, and most importantly, it would give Bella and the cubs legal protection as permanent research subjects." The idea was so perfect, so exactly what Martha would have suggested if she'd been alive to see how their story unfolded, that Bill had to sit down on the porch steps before his legs gave out entirely. "You mean we could keep them? Officially? You could keep them, and help dozens of other bear families over the years. Turn your grief into something that honors Mom's memory while protecting the creatures she loved." Sarah's voice was soft with emotion. "What do you think she'd say about that?" Bill looked out at the meadow where Tommy was now lying on his back while Hope gently licked his face, the little girl's giggles mixing with Joy's playful grunts. Bella watched the interaction with the same protective attention she'd shown her cubs from the beginning, having somehow expanded her definition of family to include the small human who brought such obvious joy to her children. "I think she'd say we found the family we were meant to have," Bill said quietly, his hand unconsciously moving to the wedding ring he still wore. "Even if it came in a form we never expected." As if summoned by his words, Bella rose from her resting spot and padded slowly toward the porch. She moved with the same dignified grace she'd shown that first night, but now there was no desperation in her approach, only the comfortable confidence of someone coming home. The mother bear settled beside Bill's chair and gently rested her massive head against his knee, a gesture of affection and trust that never failed to move him. Hope and Joy immediately abandoned their game with Tommy to join their mother, creating a pile of fur and contentment at Bill's feet. "Sometimes," he murmured, scratching behind Bella's ears while Sarah smiled and Tommy giggled at the cub's antics, "salvation really does come with claws and desperate eyes, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, it stays long enough to teach us what it means to be truly alive." In the distance, thunder rumbled across the mountains, promising another spring storm. But this time, Bill Henderson wasn't afraid of what the weather might bring to his door. His house was full of love, his heart was full of purpose, and somewhere beyond the clouds, he could almost hear Martha's laughter mixing with the wind. The family he'd thought he'd lost forever had returned in the most unexpected way possible, and this time, he was never letting them go. Sometimes, life's greatest blessings arrive at our doorstep when we least expect them, wearing forms we never imagined. Bill Henderson thought his story was over, a widower facing foreclosure, estranged from his daughter, counting down his final years in bitter loneliness. But when a desperate grizzly mother and her cubs sought shelter from a storm, everything changed. What began as an act of compassion became a journey of rediscovering purpose, rebuilding fractured family bonds, and finding that love multiplies rather than divides when we open our hearts to the unexpected. Bill's cabin, once a tomb of memories, transformed into a sanctuary where 3 generations learned what it truly means to be family. His former student Marcus found redemption through protecting the very creatures he once hunted. Sarah discovered that her father's foolish choices revealed a wisdom she'd forgotten, and 2 orphaned bear cubs grew up surrounded by the kind of unconditional love that heals all wounds. At 68, Bill learned that it's never too late for new beginnings, that sometimes our greatest act of courage is simply opening the door when hope comes knocking. The question isn't whether we're too old for second chances, it's whether we're brave enough to recognize them when they arrive. What unexpected blessing has knocked on your door when you thought your best days were behind you? Have you ever discovered that what seemed like your biggest mistake turned out to be your greatest gift? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how life surprised you with second chances.